Hello students, the topic for discussion is on psychosocial implications of visual impairment. The onset of a physical disability often comes with a number of assumptions regarding the physically disabled person's phenomenal experiences. Psychological responses to physical disability are heterogeneous in nature. Thus, pertaining to visual impairment, there is no particular psychology of blindness. Rather, the psychology of rehabilitation and visual impairment is one that considers coping and stress dimensions that vary across all individuals, not just the visually impaired. Next, we shall see the psychological implications of visual impairment. According to Jackson and Taylor 2001, who state that individuals demonstrate significant variance in their degree of psychological adjustment to vision loss. Immediate and long term adjustment difficulties include a range of depressive and anxiety symptoms, somatic complaints, behavioral problems, substance abuse, difficulty in interpersonal relationships and sub-threshold paranoia. The depressive symptoms observed in visually impaired individuals include dysphonic and irritable mood, flat or restricted affect, tearfulness, social isolation and withdrawal from others and suicidal ideation. Also, stimuli specific anxiety such as busy streets, crowded rooms, noisy halls and many other situations can provoke remarkable fear responses initially in visually impaired individuals. Furthermore, visually impaired individuals may experience visual hallucinations as a direct symptom of vision loss. In such cases, there is no known psychological correlate. The presence of visual images that range from bizarre to non-bizarre may merely be physiological correlates of vision loss, but nonetheless can be a significant source of distress for visually impaired individuals who have been poorly educated about their visual experiences. Adjusting to vision loss not only requires the visually impaired person to cope with stress, but adapt to functioning with less stimulus input from their environment. Although all senses are used in human learning, in most cases such learning is largely contingent on visual information. When visual information is restricted to any degree, learning, problem solving, orientation, memory systems and even decision making may deteriorate temporarily as a result of adjusting to less sensory awareness and stimulus input. Visually impaired individuals present with differences in personality style, attributional style, locus of control, family support, interpersonal relationships and financial availability. The dimension of effect will depend on the degree of disability and the onset of impairment. If the loss is prelingual, it has more significant impact on development, marred by experiences that leave them confused and angry. Loss of sight creates a number of changes in the individual and his family, resulting in psychological distress in all people with visual impairment. According to Carroll 1991, visual impairment may affect functional independence and compromise psychological security not only in the visually impaired individual, but in the family as well. Activities of daily living are disrupted. Communication skills are affected, impacting social functioning. They may be reluctant to attend social functions or go to crowded places for fear of embarrassment. Persons with sight loss may be afraid to leave home because of safe mobility issues. Transportation can be a problem. One could face job and financial insecurity or change in career plans. Visual impairment creates loss in aesthetic pleasure. There may be numerous qualities of life changes and changes in life goals that affect the visually impaired as well as the family. Taylor 1986 explains that sight loss affects everyone in the family and both the visually impaired person and family members can have difficulty in adjusting. Not all are equally affected and some have more difficulty than others. Role changes in the family are commonly and therefore can be stressful for all. Many express feeling of fear, resentment, guilt and apprehension. They may feel pushed to their own psychological limit. At the same time, they might also be trying to cope with economic and social changes and whatever special circumstances may apply within the context of a given family. Considering the societal point of view, blindness is a medical phenomenon. It involves different emotional reactions in different persons. The societies have developed their own image of blind persons, of their capabilities and of their limitations. Blindness does not remain a simple sensory loss to the individual. It is confounded with psychological overtones resulting in changes in the self concept of the child. In the society, people generally do not have a broad based knowledge about vision loss, but may have preconceived attitude about blindness. For example, blind persons cannot do any activity or blind persons are very good at singing. Next, we shall see the impact on the family due to vision loss. Although attention is appropriately focused on the visually impaired person, there is always a great need to understand the impact on the individual and the family system. The parents vacillate between denial, anger, guilt and despair on the one hand and overprotective love on the other hand. It has been suggested that blindness is unconsciously or even consciously viewed by the society as punishment for sin and as psychologically equivalent to castration. The blind child's first encounter with the effects of these or other emotional reactions to blindness often is within his own home. Somers is of the view that the more extensive studies in this area have found 5 major patterns of parental reaction to their blind children, and this include acceptance, denial of the effects of disability, overprotectiveness, rejection disguised as over solicitousness and anxious concern. Lastly, over rejection. Biological helplessness of early infancy initiates a dependence on other human beings and a lifetime relationship of giving and taking, obeying and challenging, pleasing and displeasing, accepting and rejecting. Children learn to fit into a society with rules, traditions, expectations, beliefs and values determined by others. They are influenced by parents, siblings, neighbors, peers, teachers, leaders, heroes and politicians. Next, we shall see the sociological implications of visual impairment. The everyday experiences of children who have visual impairment are affected because they do not respond visually to people in the environment. Maintaining eye contact during speech, smiling at someone in a friendly manner and reaching out to touch someone nearby are not innate skills for the children with visual impairment. They could not view others to learn other social skills such as eating, age appropriate behavior, clothing and knowledge about body parts. Socially appropriate behaviors must be intentionally taught to the person with visual impairment. Otherwise, other people will find difficulty in communicating with them. The child must feel accepted by peers and others in the community. If the eye contact or verbal communication is not appropriate for the age of the child, adults and children may tend to leave the child out of social events or not even talk to the child. Often, the child with visual impairment is lonely and needs structure to integrate into community activities. The child may feel isolated and have low self-esteem because he hardly takes part in the family and community events. In the social context, disability is perceived as an abnormality. Visual impairment leads to a restructuring of social relationship. Visually impaired persons are discriminated in the society on the basis of an erroneous and destructive stereotype, resulting in low self-concept and low self-esteem. They may not be even able to make independent decisions. Society thinks that blindness is a medical phenomenon. It evolves different emotional reactions in different persons. The societies have developed their own image of blind persons, of their capabilities and of their limitations. Blindness does not remain a simple sensory loss to the individual. It is confounded with psychological overtones resulting in changes in self-concept of the child. Social development is affected as children are not able to pick up non-verbal clues or gestures. If they are unable to make eye contact, they may appear disinterested and they reduce the social interactions. Loss of vision impacts motor development as the child may not be motivated. The visually impaired person and his family face serious social challenges. Directly and indirectly, visual impairment interferes with many daily activities. In the case of adults, the possibilities for gainful employment are severely limited as their participation in many activities may be reduced. This is often added a loss of social status and self-esteem. The physical limitations and psychosocial implications of visual impairment cannot be measured in exact monetary terms. Nevertheless, it is clear that they diminish the quality of life not only for blind persons, but for their families as well. Social exclusion as a result of disability means a lack of belonging in a given social context. A person with disability may face limitations in interacting with colleagues at work, fellow students and also family members. This may be as a result of his pushing these people away or from the stereotypes and societal attitudes towards disability. The impact of exclusion is that a person with disability may lack social support and social skills such as communication to cope with the disability. Psychological responses to physical disability are heterogeneous in nature. Individuals demonstrate significant variance in their degree of psychological adjustment to vision loss depending on their coping and stress dimensions. Immediate and long-term adjustment difficulties that have been reported include a range of depressive and anxiety symptoms, somatic complaints, behavioral problems including difficulty in interpersonal relationships and even subthreshold paranoia. Although evidence suggests that most presentations of depressive symptoms in visually impaired individuals do not reach threshold for a diagnosis of major depressive disorder, many traditional depressive symptoms are observed such as dysphonic and irritable mood, flat or restricted affect, tearfulness, social isolation and withdrawal from others including suicidal ideation. Also, stimuli specific anxiety may be triggered in situations that were not anxiety provoking prior to vision loss. Next, we shall see psychosocial effects on the child with visual impairment. Psychosocial development of persons with visual impairment and blindness is not affected so much by the loss of sight, but it is disrupted by the emotional overtones of the absence of sight. It is now a well known fact that children tend to achieve as much and only as much as their parents aspire them to achieve. Once parents stop treating the child as a developing individual, once they refuse to accept his capabilities and limitations in a realistic manner, his self concept is bound to be severely affected. Overprotection robs the child of his independence. Neglect turns him to undesirable behaviors. Either way, it is the suffering child whose handicap multiplies. The effect of visual disability to be minimized and altogether eliminated require planned intervention for the child. An understanding teacher can guide the visually impaired to help him develop healthy self concept. For this, the teacher should have knowledge about the social milieu of the visually impaired child and should have a faith in the capabilities of the child despite his loss of vision. Being a part of the community, he may need to modify reactions and attitudes. The teacher should counsel the parents when required. Sensitization of the peers and the community is required to correct stereotype behaviors and to build an encouraging climate for the child. The requirements are many and varying in view of the needs of the child, and the only asset to the teacher is his ingenuity with which he may be able to overcome prejudices to help the visually impaired child to grow as a normal person as his potentialities permit. Briefly speaking, a healthy community attitude and the provision of equal opportunities are the needs of the visually impaired person today for their socio-economic rehabilitation. Recent progress has demonstrated the potentials of individuals with visual impairment to achieve a good measure of successful participation in the mainstream society. There has been significant improvement in the quality of life of many visually impaired persons in areas such as education, employment, mobility and public acceptance. Today, the new atmosphere of opportunity and hope, the awareness of individual potentials has encouraged personal initiative and fostered more positive self-image. Lowenfield 1980 reviewed the literature on public attitudes towards blindness and concluded that although many studies support the contention that people who are blind and perceived to be helpless and dependent, attitudes are changing. He further suggests that much of the information generated by research is inconclusive and that more in-depth studies are needed. Lowenfield's optimism concerning the growth of a social consciousness in regard to the blind is certainly a welcome perception, but it is not entirely supported in the literature. Attitudes of the general public are not necessarily those of acceptance and integration. Willis, Groves and Furman 1979 suggest a visual disability may well be the most difficult exceptionality for sighted persons to accept. Adjusting to vision loss not only requires the visually impaired person to cope with stress, but adapt to functioning with less stimulus input from their environment. Research suggests that although virtually all senses are used in human learning, in most cases such learning is largely contingent on visual information. When visual information is restricted to any degree, learning, problem solving, orientation, memory systems and even decision making may deteriorate temporarily as a result of adjusting to less sensory awareness and stimulus input. Further, it is suggested that visually impaired individuals present with differences in personality style, attributional style, locus of control, family support, interpersonal relationships and financial availability. Such factors are beyond the control of educational, rehabilitational professionals providing services to the visually impaired. However, they can contribute to the overall adjustment by becoming sensitized to the unique needs of the visually impaired. Next, we shall see some of the adaptation strategies. There are certain adaptation strategies that a visually impaired person adopts. These include 6 positive strategies and 5 negative strategies. Some of the 6 positive strategies include: 1. Acceptance. Acceptance involves acknowledging the disability, that is, ignoring its limitations and emphasizing its possibilities. The person reevaluates those aspects of life that were important before the disability and discovers new values and interests that are not influenced by the condition. Second, trust. Trust involves accepting social support from others, but may also be a religious belief or a philosophy of life that gives comfort and hope. There is also a strong reliance on healthcare and medical advances to find a cure. Third, positive avoidance. Positive avoidance is the ability to focus attention away from the problematic and frightening aspects of disability, a way of dissipating anxiety and grief. This includes listening to music, meeting people, taking a walk, and thus living each day and getting optimal pressure at each moment. Fourth, minimization. This involves viewing the disability in a realistic terms and thinking other people are worse off so that it seems less serious. Fifth, independence. Independence means taking personal responsibility for maintaining a good quality of life and viewing difficulties as challenges to be mastered. Lastly, control. Control involves controlling and compensating for the loss of function such as obtaining technical aids. It involves informing oneself about one's disability and being attentive to symptoms that may develop so that one can control their effects. To plan and to be prepared to resolve the problems that may occur is the characteristic of this theme. It is also known as problem focusing coping methods. Some of the 5 negative adaptation strategies are: 1. Denial. Denial means not acknowledging the disability. It may be expressed as an unrealistic hope for a cure and as such take the form of daydreaming and fantasies. Number 2, resentment. Resentment is a feeling of bitterness about having become a victim of the disease. The person resents that he can no longer do all the things that he used to do. Number 3, shame. Shame is the feeling of inferiority in comparison to healthy people. The person feels ashamed of being different from what he or she used to be. Number 4, isolation. Isolation involves the feeling of being an outsider, of being misunderstood by others. As a result, the person avoids socialization. Number 5, helplessness. Helplessness is the feeling of self-pity and of not being able to cope in the immediate environment. So far, we have discussed about some of the psychosocial effects of the child with visual impairment in terms of sociological implications, family impact, psychological implications and some of the adaptation strategies. Thank you.